So in this mini lecture, we want to discuss introductions and conclusions. Well, Billy Graham began and ended his ministry well. How can you begin and end your sermon well? I think that is a fitting question that all of us have to grapple with and work through on any given week. So how can you begin your sermon well? How can you end it well? So we want to look at introductions and conclusions as part of this mini lecture. Introduction to your sermons. If you think about introductions, they can either put someone to sleep, or it could literally capture their moment in time where they're like, wow, that really drew me into what you're going to show us, or at least uncover from this particular passage. So you want to begin thinking now about, is there some illustration that I could begin to set the tone for the biblical passage that I'm presenting? What needs to happen in order to listen? Are you going to listen to me, or are you going to turn me off at this point in time? So when you think about biblical preaching, Haddon Robinson talks about the 2-minute warning that everyone has in a moment in time. It's for the preacher to get out exactly the point in time. And again, he has 2 minutes right at the beginning to shape the message and where he intends to go for the next 30 minutes. So you have 2 minutes now to think about your sermon shape and how might it work as you think about the theological topic or the evangelistic preaching that you'll be uncovering, or whatever the Lord has assigned you for that day that you prepared. Think through the transitions from beginning to end and make sure they're shaping up so that the people who are listening know exactly where you're heading. There are 3 types of preachers that we would like to cover. First, it's those whom you cannot listen to. Have you ever been in a sermon, a church setting, worship time where the preacher is coming up and you're like, uh-oh, you already know that this is not going to be a good sermon? It sounds like as he begins, they are unprepared, they're distracted, they don't have their notes maybe organized, and then you have the technological failure of your iPad not starting up. And so be ready, be prepared. Are people going to engage with you as you open up and present God's word? Second, to those whom you can listen, meaning as you think about the preacher and the organized thoughts that are coming out of their mouth, are they shaping the passage for you? Are they bringing you into the content of the listening moment so that you can actually begin to write down maybe key thoughts or ideas that he is presenting? And those to whom you must listen. There's a moment in time when the preaching moment where there's maybe a prophetic word that needs to be heard coming from the biblical passage, that you can find the preacher's authority from the Bible passage. It's not how loud they shout. It's not how loud or sustained length of yelling, but do they raise up the biblical point in order for you to say, wow, that was really important and I need to heed the warning, as like the book of Hebrews says, today, if you hear God's word, we're to repent, we're to listen to him, or not be like how the Israelites rebelled in the wilderness. So 3 types of preachers, and then when we think through the introduction to the congregation, it is at that moment that the people begin to decide whether they're going to listen, or really your introduction shapes who you are as a preacher and how you've approached your style. So do you begin by shouting, or do you begin with a story, illustration to shape an introduction of where you intend to go for the next 30 minutes? Some, it might extend to 40 minutes depending on the setting. So I was up all night, hours fiddling with the speech, so I'm sure you'll like it. Yeah, I've heard people begin that way. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to say. I would say this: don't apologize as a first statement coming out of of the blocks as you begin to preach. What examples of sermons that began with apologies can you give? Don't ever say, I spent all night preparing for this message. Don't look like you're rushed and hurry and you lack preparation for your sermon. I would just avoid any type of comments like that. Or I had difficulty with this passage. Or I was late preparing my thoughts around, don't look holier than thou. Approach the text, get going on the direction you intend to go, and shape the biblical moment in time. Sorry, but I can't speak English. I've heard that as well from maybe people whose language is not English, and or they're sloppy and they stutter or things of that nature. So don't apologize. Next, I want to look at clues the audience gets when they become involved during the moment in time. Of course, there's the emotional involvement where people can laugh. You might have some humor, and that's totally fine as long as it doesn't take away from the preaching moment and it has its right effect. People also know they're listening to you is if they're taking notes. They might have a notebook handy. Maybe your church provides a bulletin, and on the back of the bulletin there are a place for filling in the outline. And of course, there are people who are attentively looking as you're speaking. They have making eye contact with you, and you're making eye contact with them. Some other things that the audience neglect, you begin to see people dozing off. I've experienced an actual person snoring. There are people fiddling around with games. Today, as we think about electronics, you never know what's behind the pew as people are fiddling around with their phones. You don't even know people are on Facebook or social media outlets. Just no. Then there's the blank stare approach. People are just, it looks like they're just not connecting with you. Just be careful. It might be you because you've not prepared well to present the biblical text. They say it's rough. It's a tough job to preach at this church. I remember inviting a guest speaker, and that was the first thing that came out of his mouth was that statement. And I saw this in a cartoon. I'm like, oh, how aptly this is to think about. That should not come out of your mouth. That this church is very difficult to preach at. So get their attention early and make sure you're capturing that attention and it fits within the biblical text of where you're going. Remember, the people in your church have remote syndrome. They're ready to turn you off at any given moment in time because you're not connecting with them. Maybe you lack passion and motivation, and maybe you started off really bad and they just now are turning off and hoping that you'll end that message pretty soon. Of course, the remote syndrome has its own effect. Audience have remotes in their heads and can switch off the channel at any moment when they sense something else is more interesting. So you want to keep the flow, you want to keep the momentum as you move ahead, keep their interest along the way. Think about those points. Number one, there are 3 things I want to cover with you today. There are 4 things I want to cover with you. Keep their interest, remind them what you're covering, and show them those cues early on in your sermon opening. Another thing often Lewis Smedes talks about the whole description of what are people really thinking about. They're coming to church, they're already distracted, they've already been a couple hours by the time they woke up, they've had breakfast. What are people thinking about when you are talking? What's their struggle? What's the longing of their heart? We've already mentioned that already in one mini lecture. Mention again just as a way of preparing your heart as you present the biblical text. Wasn't everybody expecting a resurrection? Think about that question for a moment and ask yourself, is that a good opening question to begin your sermon? And you'll find that sometimes when you frame right at the get-go of your sermon a question, people have already turned off or it's not stimulating enough to capture their attention. So we're going to begin to talk about this and unfold this some more as we work through this class and as we work through this mini lecture. So why wouldn't you think, or what would be the reasons why you wouldn't start with this question? So I want you to pause there for a moment. Observe the question. Could you start the question in a different way, rearrange it in a different way? What might you probe to think if this was your opening statement as you begin your sermon? If you wanted to destroy a society without the use of weapons, how would you do it? Is this a good opening question? Why or why not? I want you to think about that. Maybe write down some comments here and to begin formulating what does it take to ask a question of a biblical passage and the people that you are ministering to. So think about this beginning statement here as you see this title, Christian Church. Actually, it might be contradictory, and so you need to think about your prepositions, think about how you would begin your sermon and capturing the beginning and also the conclusion or your concluding thoughts. And again, while we think these are more humorous than statements, just know that this has been some of the obstacles in our preaching along the way that we have said, we've been guilty of saying, and we think it's actually good preaching when it's really not. Well, of course, all of our work that we do in a church comes from a variety of different sources, and within those sources we have to think through the channels and the noise that exists with people, and people are struggling, and so because of the struggle you need to help them get through the different nuances, the color, the noise, the distraction, and you need to shape the truth in such a way that doesn't distort the truth but actually presents what the biblical writer had intended to do. So let's talk about some introductions. This is what I often call this the grip. So you need to get an attention on the subject that in order to get the matter raised or the need that is raised for the moment in time. So everyone's thinking about I'm sitting now in worship. What's the pastor going to say? I have these desires, I have these longings, I have these questions. Is he able to answer some of those questions? And really, that is what you should be thinking about today in your preparation for your sermon. So help them admit that they wear a mask. And I think that's ultimately all of us do. So we may be talking about hypocrisy for our sermon, and we put on a mask. And people may not think they do that. People might think they're really honest with one another. And if you're wanting to dig deeper in terms of relationship, this is the way you begin to probe with them and ask the question or redirect it in such a way to capture their attention. And so how do you raise the need? We often talk about stories, personal illustrations. Avoid making fun of yourself or making fun of your family or your wife, your spouse. Avoid doing that, but make sure if you do share a personal illustration from your family that you get their permission, especially from your kids. As they get older, they begin to sit in your message and they don't want to be the puppet of your jokes, especially if it's embarrassing. But nonetheless, personal stories are really, really helpful along the way to shape the biblical moment and to keep person's attention. They see you as real, and they now know you're real, okay? That you make mistakes, and as they make mistakes along the way. So as you move through the questions, you ask the question, you raise it up, you explore it with them. You might state it in multiple different ways, and you move the listener along through your message. Now, when we talk about the grip pat is you get the attention on the subject, you raise the need, you introduce the subject, which is eventually then transition to your main idea or your main principal point that you're going to demonstrate. And then along the way, you're providing the background around the chapter, the verses, the exegetical work that you prepared. You can't present everything, but you only present the most important truths at this point in time. Share only relevant background information. Raise the need, Share the background. Don't get so far along that it sounds like a Bible class in seminary or undergrad, because simply people aren't quite there. Only share the most important facts, theological truth that someone's going to be able to write down quickly, and you take it back to the biblical text right away. Give background information before you explore the text, set the historical backdrop, and move the person along in your opening introduction to set the pace. So we move from need, the background, and then finally, let's look at the Bible passage that we are looking at or considering today. So you raise the attention in order to gain the subjects hear the attention as they're sitting there. You raise the need. Why should I listen to what you have to say? Provide some subject and background information as you move through the biblical texts. So contact points: secular, personal, structural, biblical. Let me go back to that as you think about it. Review your outline as you're moving along in your sermon. State number 1, number 2, number 3. If that's all you have, you want to clearly say that pretty clearly as you move from one transitional point to the next. Now, some preachers have an A and a B and a C under the Roman numeral pointing, and that's fine as long as you're clear and you present that to the people as they listen to you. Now, one way to spotlight your message is to begin a preview process as you lead your people through the sermon. And the way we do that is, and how it is performed is that you review your subject. Secondly, you provide how many points you're going to cover. We're going to explore 3 things from this passage that will help us, what? X, Y, Z. It's going to help us live out a godly life. Is going to set our minds thinking in the right direction upon the scripture. And again, you're reviewing it with them, and then you lay it out. And so here are some examples. There are many you can do. There's 2 ways this passage refers to God. There's 3 reasons why you and I should get dirty for others. We're trying to make it that really practical there. There's 3 principles that we can find in this Bible passage about finding a godly mate. And what does God think of missions? And what is my personal response? I might frame it in that particular way with a question. Often avoid questions, but as points. And I like to state points in active expression and present form instead of in past tense, but sometimes you can't avoid that, and you're just going to have to tweak it and rework it so that it makes sense as you prepare that Sunday morning. Let's go review the grip pat. The grip pat, again, is it gets attention on the subject, it raises the need, introduces the subject and the main idea, the main point, or the big idea, as Haddon Robinson says, the central propositional point. Again, provide some background, review your outline, announce your text a couple times. We're going to look at this text, these verses, and then transition to your main point as a preliminary beginning within your sermon. Again, that's the introduction. So there are some incomplete transitions that take place. One might be, how can we know how to speak to non-Christians? Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. That might be what we consider an incomplete thought that needs further treatment there as we work through the question. Well, we're to speak with gracious words. We found in chapters verse 6, we're speak with wise words. So we preview it. We will see 2 ways to speak to non-Christians. You see how I spotlight that? Rather, looking at the subject, I move from the subject to previewing the beginning of my outline. And so the first way we speak to non-Christians is, number 1, we speak with gracious words. Number 2, we speak with wise words. And the second way, again, we're repeating the communication process. And so in some ways, this is a perfect way as we think about speech communication, working through the structure of our sermon. Why are good conclusions so vital? Well, here's what it is that we work through the entire message and we review it with our audience and bring it to a conclusion, provide some finality or action points that they can walk out with. Conclusions are also remembered. It's probably the last 5 minutes of your sermon as you bring it to a close. Those are the things that people are going to remember. And often, and at the end of the day, illustrations are too. The story shapes the moment, not necessarily the biblical text that you've been uncovering. They'll forget that. And there's a benefit to that too, because you can always go back to a Bible passage or even a topic that maybe you've covered along the way this last year and reteach that passage again, because God's word's alive and it's active and it's sharper than any two-edged sword. And so why not preach that passage again if there's been some time that has elapsed? You may have to recover some different illustrations if you intend to do so. Just remember that. But remember, conclusions are important. They can be remembered and they can be retold to someone else that maybe wasn't there at the church service that you were presenting. What people remember the most are the speaker's first words and the last words they utter. If you're going to make a mistake, let it occur, as one communicator says, in the middle of that speech. So here are some conclusions. Stain. Remember the word stain, and hopefully this will help you work through your conclusion. State your main point, restate it again, review it several times throughout the service, the sermon itself. Tell the main points. Tell the people what you're going to cover. Restate it. Review it with them. And then finally, the old adage is probably correct on clarity. Tell them what you're going to tell them and tell them what you told them. That is so important as you think about your biblical preaching. Tell them exactly what you intend to cover. And then some conclusions. Again, state your main point, tell the main points, apply and exhort obedience, include a variety. Don't always begin with a poem or a silly illustration. Provide a variety of ways that you begin with the introduction and conclude. A song may not always be the best way to conclude a sermon. Might be just a simple challenge that you give to your people. Don't always end with a poem or some fancy prayer that kind of brings the sermon together. Think creatively, and also don't exaggerate as well. That would be also mistreating the text as you have presented. But we can talk more about that as we think about biblical preaching, and hope that encouraged you as you think about STAIN as the acronym, the conclusion for your sermon. State your main idea, restate it, tell the main points, apply and exhort obedience, include variety, never announce the conclusion. I've heard preachers do that. Now I'm going to conclude, or now for my conclusion. And again, I've done that on occasion. Now for my final thought here. I get it. We make those blunders, but we need to refine our skill. And none of us have arrived at this in our life. So I want you to walk out realizing I still have to refine. Even if I've been preaching for 30 years, I'm still working through my preaching approach to make sure, are there ways that I can improve my speaking? Can I clear up any jargon? What do I need to improve from week end to the next week? So I review my sermon. I listen to it. I watch my body language, how I present myself. Do I repeat words often, phrases? How can I avoid that in order to bring a variety to my biblical preaching? And then, of course, ask others in your leadership to assess you and to do it with kindness and mercy. And a lot of guys won't want to do it, but it's needed. And it makes you sharper as you think about your biblical preaching into the future. Hope that helps. And this concludes this mini lecture for you. In conclusion, right? We already said we shouldn't be doing that, but I hope this helps, and I hope it encourages you to think about biblical preaching. Until we meet again by video, may you see your preaching excel even more as the weeks go by in this course.